Hello, dear aspirants. Welcome back to Goldfinch IAS and KS Institutes. And today we're going to discuss a very important article, that is why is fiscal consolidation is so important. The first question is, what is fiscal consolidation? Fiscal consolidation meaning the policies implemented by the national governments, the policies implemented by the national governments to decrease the debt burden of the government or deficit of the government. Right, we know already what is deficit meaning shortage. For example, the government got 30 lakh crore rupees as the national income or the revenue received by the government in a particular year. Right, it is the total revenue, it is the total revenue of the government. The total expenditure of the government is 40 lakh, so 47 lakh crore rupees. Then what is the shortage here? 17 lakh crore rupees is the shortage. No, to decrease this shortage, government takes a certain measures. Those measures are called fiscal consolidation. Right? So today's class is all about discussion of this. Let's get started and dig into this particular article and see what else it is going to tell us. The article actually derives its content from the recent budget presented by the Honorable Finance Minister. That is, the center would reduce its fiscal deficit to 5.1% in the year 2014, in the year 2024 and 25. And she further stated that the fiscal deficit would be pared to below 4.5% of the GDP by 2025-2026. So this has actually surprised most analysts because who were expecting actually the fiscal deficit target would be 5.3% to 5.4%, and she's many have analyzed that it is over targeted fiscal deficit. And also the government mentioned that revised estimates are also for this particular fiscal year 2023-2024. It is predicted it around 5.8% of the GDP. This is how the article starts with. And first of all, we must know what is fiscal deficit. What do you mean by fiscal deficit? I have told you what is fiscal deficit in my previous classes as well. If you're not watched that videos, please go and I'll give you in the description box. Please go to those videos because in my last two videos I taught about fiscal deficit. You watch them and come back here. Fiscal deficit refers to the shortfall in a government's revenue when compared to its expenditure. It says the total expenditure of the government is exceeding the total income of the government. Right? So as I told you in the best example, that is, so total expenditure of the government here 47 lakh crore rupees. Total income of the government is 30 lakh crore rupees. Shortage is 17 lakh crore rupees. Right? So this is the shortage. Right? So and to compensate this, what the government will do? Government either will borrow the money or sell its asset. Only two options the government got. To come out from this fiscal deficit, government will go and borrow money or government will sell its assets. So there are only two ways for the government to come out of it in a fiscal deficit consolidation measure, or else government can also increase its taxes and thereby it can decrease the fiscal deficit, but it will take very long term. In a shorter term, these are the two options the government got. And taxes are the most important source of revenue of any government. In 2024 and 25, the government is said the tax revenues at 26.02 lakh crore rupees and total revenues are 30.8 lakh crore rupees. See, tax revenues are 26.2 lakh crore rupees and non-tax revenues are the remaining. So what is the total? 30.8 lakh crore rupees. And what is the expenditure? Is expected it at around 47.66 lakh crore rupees is the expenditure. When the government runs a fiscal surplus, the fiscal surplus meaning it is reverse to fiscal deficit, opposite to fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit meaning what? Expenditure is more, income is less. Right? Expenditure is more, income is less. In fiscal surplus, what happens? So income is more. The total income of the government is more, and the total expenditure of the government is very less. Right? It is going opposite to it. Right? And it is, however, quite rare. It is very rare because normally no government will, make it a fiscal surplus because they will produce some popular measures, they will bring some schemes and programs, and they need to, keep the confidence of the people on the government. That is the reason government will be keep on spending. Right? So very quite rare for governments to run a surplus. Right? The fiscal deficit should not be confused with the national debt. The national debt means accumulation of the fiscal deficit. For example, this year fiscal deficit is 17 lakh crore rupees. plus next year is another 17 lakh crore rupees, right? Plus a further year is also 17 lakh crore rupees. Accumulation of these, fiscal deficits put together is called debt. You got it, no? Next is, how does government fund its fiscal deficit? Because there are mainly two important ways where the government can, take its funds. One is by selling the government's bonds in the open market operations. Normally, this is done by the Reserve Bank of India on behalf of the government of India. RBI sells government bonds or the government securities in the open market operations, right? And thereby the government will borrow from the bond market. The government will borrow from the market by selling the bonds or the government securities. In short, it is called government securities, right? Because the government, for this reason, will issue treasury bills, cash management bills, dated securities, etc. Right? In 2024 and 25, this is one way, right? In 2024-25, there is expected to borrow around 14.13 lakh crore rupees from the bond market. Right? Second is from the Reserve Bank of India. Listen very, very carefully. Here, RBI is not going to directly lend to government. The government is not directly lending to the government here. The RBI is lending indirectly to the government. When the RBI conducts open market operations, all the participants like the banks, primary dealers, financial institutions, all will participate and borrow the government bonds from the RBI when RBI conducts the open market operations. This is called a primary market. This is called primary market, which means directly the government securities are bought by these institutions from the RBI, right? If RBI borrow these bonds from these institutions later on, after 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, like that, it is called a secondary market. Correct? So indirectly by borrowing from the secondary market, RBI is going to help or assist the government in funding the government. To do that, so the RBI will use a market called open market operations. So open market operation meaning it is a market where the government securities are bought and sold by the RBI. The central government's lending rate were near to zero in many countries during the COVID-19 period. Right? During the COVID-19, the interest rate among the banks was remaining, it was almost to zero. Why it was zero? Because to encourage economic activities in the country, because the demand was tremendously decreased during the COVID-19. No, to increase the demand, they are all decrease the interest rate. If interest rates are less, bank will borrow more or cheaper loans from the RBI and the central governments, and they will lend cheaper loans to the people, and people will get more money and they will start spending. That is how the economy will boost back. Correct? No. But later on, what happened? This interest rate gradually increased. See, normally what happens in an economy, see, for example, it will go in a cycle like this, right? So one is a boom. During a boom period, normally the interest rates will be high. Next, this position is a recession. When the economy was in recession during COVID-19, governments, central banks have tremendously decreased the interest rate to encourage the money circulation in the economy, right? That happened, but as the money circulation happened, it is lent because government spend and RBI decreased the interest rate, money circulation tremendously increased. No, because of this reason inflation happened. Because of the inflation, to control the inflation, the central banks have increased the interest rates. During a recession, normally the central banks decreases the interest rate to boost the demand, and during the inflation, the governments increases the policy rates, that is the interest rate, to decrease the demand or to balance it because of to control the inflation. Right? Because of this reason, the government would not get right. The government would not get a cheaper loans from the system or the market. And next is very important is, why does the fiscal deficit matter? The fiscal deficit definitely matter for four reasons. One is there is a direct relationship between the fiscal deficit and the inflation. I just told you before. If the fiscal deficit increases, what does it mean? If the FD increases, it means the government is borrowing more and more money. If the government borrow more money, what happens to money circulation? Money circulation will also increases. As the money circulation increases, don't you think it will also contribute for more inflation? Because people will spend more money and it will lead to more money circulation and more inflation. Prices will go up. This is one reason. The second is lower fiscal deficit may help the government to improve the rating assigned to the Indian government bonds. What do you mean by that? It means the fiscal deficit, if it's under control, the government can take cheaper loans from the banks, cheaper loans from the market, that is the open market operations. If the fiscal deficit is more, the investors will have a very less confidence on the government, then they will be charging more interest to borrow the bonds from the government. You understand? So let's take an example. Government bonds are like a piece of paper. They are denominated in rupees like this. If, for example, it is 100 rupees. If 100 rupees meaning this is bought by the banks, for example, if the fiscal deficit is actually under control of the government, then they will give government 97 rupees. Then they will give 97 rupees to the government and borrow this bond. And the banks will make 3 rupees of profit only. You understand? And government is paying 100 rupees and government is giving a bond of 100 rupees and government is taking 97 rupees. Once the bond get maturity, government will give only 3 rupees as an interest. Correct? When the fiscal deficit is under control. If the fiscal deficit is not under control, then in the bond market, the government bond value will decrease. Then people or the banks and other financial institutions would be interested to borrow this particular bond from the government at a rate of around, you can take an example of 90 rupees, which means the financial institutions are going to make a profit of 10 rupees and government will lose 10 rupees from its pocket at the time of maturity of the bond. You understood the difference? When the fiscal deficit was under control, government is paying around only 3 rupees as an interest. When the fiscal deficit is increased and people and the investors lost the confidence on the government, then government will pay more interest, that is 10 rupees. This is how it will play an important role. And third reason is actually high fiscal deficit can adversely affect the government's public debt because it will accumulate more debt and it will lead to debt trap as well. Such a situation should not arise. And fourth one is lower fiscal deficit can help the government to more easily sell the same bonds in the overseas and the international market for a cheaper credit. You got it? So this is how the fiscal deficit matters. Last but not the least, and what lies ahead is the central government expects the tax revenue collection would increase by 11.5% in 2024-2025, and government is actually decreasing the expenditure that particularly the fertilizer subsidy and the food subsidy. The statistics are given here. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you. Bye bye.